When you think of the Victorian era, what comes to mind? Probably things like smokestacks, fancy dresses, a powerful British Empire, right? But what if I told you that's not even half the story? Because beneath all that progress and prim and proper veneer was a world buzzing with conflict, anxiety, and massive world-changing ideas. It's a huge paradox, and we're about to unpack it.
So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll dive right into the core contradictions of the age. Then, we'll see how Britain was literally forged in iron and steam. After that, we'll look at the steep price of its empire, feel the anxieties that came with all this change, and finally, see how ordinary people started demanding a better world.
All right, let's get into it. The whole Victorian experience, at its very heart, is an age of contradiction. So many people at the time truly believed they were living in a golden age of peace and prosperity. But the reality? Oh, it was a whole lot messier. And this is the central tension of the whole era. Think about it. On one hand, if you were living in Britain itself, things were remarkably peaceful. But, and it's a huge but, that peace didn't come cheap. It was bought and paid for with almost non-stop wars overseas to keep the British Empire running. And even back home, the Industrial Revolution was completely turning society upside down, changing everything about how people lived.
So what was the engine driving all this power and supposed peace? Well, it really boils down to one thing: Britain's absolute world-beating dominance in industry.
You've probably heard the phrase, the workshop of the world. Well, that wasn't just some catchy slogan back then. It was literally true. Iron and steam were the pulse of the nation. Britain's factories, its mines, its railways, they were second to none, which let it just completely dominate global trade and pile up incredible amounts of wealth. And if you want to see that confidence in action, just look at the Great Exhibition of 1851. This thing was a global spectacle, held in this mind-blowing glass and iron building called the Crystal Palace. It was basically Britain showing off all its industrial muscle for the whole world to see. But here's that classic Victorian paradox again. All that gleaming progress and prosperity just made the massive gap between the rich and the poor impossible to ignore. Economically, the name of the game was laissez-faire capitalism. You know, a totally hands-off approach from the government. It led to explosive growth, for sure, but it also led to some pretty horrific exploitation of workers. It actually took a long time before the government was finally forced to step in and start regulating things. And that slow shift is a huge deal. It shows just how much thinking was changing during the era itself. Now, all this industrial power wasn't just building railways, it was building an empire. And that extraordinary peace back home, it came with a very high price, one that was paid in brutal wars fought thousands of miles away. You can kind of bookend this era of peace with two really significant conflicts. First, there was the Crimean War against Russia. This was a massive shock to the public because for the first time ever, newspapers were reporting the grim realities of a modern war. Then, at the very end of the century, you have the Boer Wars in South Africa, a really nasty fight over gold and diamonds that would shake the empire to its core. The Boer War, especially, was a brutal wake-up call. Here you had the mighty British Army in their famous red coats getting picked apart by Boer commandos using modern rifles and guerrilla tactics. To win, Britain resorted to using concentration camps, which brought condemnation from all over the world. The war didn't just expose old-fashioned tactics, it completely shattered the myth of British invincibility. The message was loud and clear: modernize or the empire would fall. So you'd think with all this progress, industrial, economic, imperial, everyone would be feeling pretty good, right? Well, not exactly. All that change also cooked up a whole new set of anxieties. And as the century wore on, you could really start to see the cracks forming in that confident Victorian facade. By the late Victorian period, the empire felt like it was under siege. A global economic depression hit right as new industrial powerhouses like the USA and Canada started to challenge Britain. And back home, the political scene was a pressure cooker. Demands for Irish independence, for women's right to vote, and for workers' rights were getting louder and louder every single year. And then, as if all that wasn't stressful enough, along came a massive intellectual earthquake: Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. The idea that humans weren't some divine creation, but had actually descended from apes, it was absolutely earth-shattering. And it raised a terrifying new question. If we evolved up from apes, could we just as easily slide right back down?
This led to what historians now call degenerationist anxieties. It was this deep cultural fear that civilization was just a thin, fragile layer. Think of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That story perfectly captures the terror that underneath every respectable gentleman, there's a primitive beast lurking, just waiting to drag society back into the dark.
So you've got all these pressures, industrial, imperial, intellectual, all swirling together and creating a society in turmoil. But out of that turmoil came powerful, undeniable calls for change, calls that would ultimately give birth to the modern world as we know it.
One of the era's greatest legacies was the birth of the social state. And it didn't happen because of some grand plan. It happened out of pure necessity. Crises like horrific cholera epidemics finally forced the government to intervene in public health. That first little step grew into a social service state that focused on education and housing. And that, in turn, laid the very groundwork for the modern welfare systems a lot of us have today. The other huge transformation was political. The simple idea of one person, one vote. I mean, it seems so obvious to us now, but back then, it was a radical, revolutionary idea. And the fight for it became one of the defining struggles of the age. And wow, was it a long, hard-fought battle. It happened in stages, through a series of reform acts across the century that slowly, painfully, expanded who was allowed to vote. It's actually incredible to think that it wasn't until 1928, almost a century after this all started, that something close to true universal suffrage was finally achieved. The seeds of our modern democracy were all planted right there. So the Victorian legacy is just immense. And it's packed with all those contradictions. It was an era of incredible industrial progress that also shone a bright light on deep social problems. It was a time that built the foundations of the modern welfare state, and at the same time was the starting point for the long, hard fight for the voting rights that shape our world today.
Which brings us right back to our big question. Was it an age of glorious progress or a time of troubling paradox? Well, the truth is, it was both. And that's exactly what makes the Victorians so endlessly fascinating. So what do you think? How should we remember them?